Hello, World History 1 students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is the first video in a new unit on early civilizations. This video is going to introduce the idea of civilization, specifically river valley civilizations. We're going to talk about what those are, and you need to be able to answer this question: how did civilizations begin? In 3 to 4 sentences in your notes packet at the end of the video. In our last unit, we talked about the agricultural revolution and how it was really important and led to a lot of changes. And a lot of these changes took the form of civilization. Civilization is a complex, organized society. And remember, before farming, people lived in simpler societies with fewer people, and they were nomadic and they were hunter-gatherers. But when people began to settle down and they began to use their time to do other things besides get food, they started to make their societies more complicated. They started to do different kinds of things that a lot of the time we now take for granted. So we're going to talk about some features of civilization. I'm going to very briefly go over what these features are, but there's a lot more to them we'll talk about in class, I'm sure. First off, we already talked about job specialization, which is when different people do different jobs and then they're able to trade. This also is connected to social classes, which is where some jobs earn more money and have more power than others. So you end up with some people at the top of society, and then some people in the middle, and then some people on the bottom. Government, organized government, creates laws, runs armies, and basically keeps society organized. Religion is based on people's beliefs about the way that the world works, particularly with like a spiritual dimension to it. Frequently connects to an afterlife. Art and architecture, like the pyramids that you can see in the picture here, are also a feature of the civilization. And then writing. Writing can help to contribute to art and architecture, but it can also help government and religion. It's helpful to be able to write things down so that you can be more organized and keep detailed records of your institutions and your organizations that you have. So these features of civilization developed in 4 specific river valleys on this map, which you can see here, and I'm going to just name them for you so that you can write them down in your notes. And we're going to spend, each of these places is going to get a full video. So we're going to introduce the idea of river valley civilizations, and then the next few videos are going to go to a little more depth on each of them. First, we have Mesopotamia, which is a civilization based around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So I've put the name of the civilization on top and the name of the rivers that are connected to it below the name of the civilization. Mesopotamia was centered around the Tigris and Euphrates. You may already know that Egypt was based around the Nile River in Africa. And then in South Asia, we have the Indus Valley Civilization, which becomes India. And originally, Indian civilization was centered on the Indus River Valley, and then later it would spread to the Ganges River Valley. So India has the Indus and the Ganges, and then in Eastern Asia, we have China and the Huanghe River Valley. So you need to know these 4 civilizations, and you need to know the rivers that are associated with them. Make sure that you write down the names of the rivers as well as the names of the civilizations. So why did rivers help civilization to happen? How did early societies develop in these river valleys? Well, when you see a river like the one in this picture, the water in this river is full of something called silt. And silt is like little bits of dirt and mud, basically. They're floating in the water. And from time to time, the river will flood, particularly in the springtime when the snows melt and they flow down out of the mountains into the river, and it'll cause the river to overflow its banks. And when it does that, it can be very destructive, but it's also really a good thing for the soil. All of that silt that's in the water is left deposited in the soil around the river, and it makes the soil really rich and fertile. And that means that there's lots of nutrients in the soil that are good for crops. And that means that it makes farming easier. So flooding deposits silt in the soil, makes the soil rich and good for farming. Also, there's irrigation. And here you can see an illustration of an irrigation ditch. That's when you dig a canal or a channel away from the river to channel the water to the crops, and helps you to water the crops more efficiently and helps you to grow more food. And here you can see an illustration of an early society that is using an irrigation canal, and they're growing lots of wheat and barley in their fields. This is actually supposed to be Egypt, you can tell because it says the River Nile in the background. And all of this complexity is coming from the fact that they have a food surplus. When you're able to grow a lot of food in a river valley because of the fertile soil and the irrigation, you end up with lots of extra food, and you have stores of food, and people feel more like they have a very stable food supply. They know nothing's going to happen to cause them to starve. And then people begin to spend their energy and their attention on other things. So that's what we call job specialization. In early civilizations in China, India, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, people began to specialize in things other than farming. Here you can see some artifacts. You can see in the lower right-hand corner some bronze work that was done in Shang, China. On the left, you can see some jewelry from the Indus Valley civilization of Mohenjo-daro. And then down on the bottom, you can see some Egyptians are weaving cloth or paper. I'm not quite sure which one. They're using natural resources to make some sort of textile. All of that, again, as I said a few minutes ago, leads to a social hierarchy where you have people with the desirable jobs, the easier jobs with more prestige and power, rising to the top, and there's fewer of those. And then as you go further down the pyramid, you end up with less desirable jobs that require harder work and more manual labor. Farming is usually towards the bottom of the pyramid. There's usually in each society going to be a lot of farmers doing a lot of hard work. And at the bottom of every pyramid social hierarchies in the ancient world, you have slaves. It's really important to remember that slavery in the ancient world is not based on race. In America, we think of slavery and race going together for very good reason. That's how American slavery operated. In the ancient world, people didn't really think about race. It wasn't a concept that they had. Slavery, instead of being based on race, was based on people going into debt. If you couldn't pay your debts, you would be sold into slavery. Or if you were taken prisoner in a war, a lot of times you would be enslaved. And slaves, as you would imagine, had the hardest jobs and were owned as property, and it was a terrible life to have. One more thing to talk about is part of the job specialization that developed in these river valleys led to the development of new metal tools. In our prehistory unit, we talked a lot about stone tools, and stone tools are complicated to make and require skill, but they're not as good as metal tools. And so in these river valleys, you start to see bronze work. Bronze metal work comes from adding copper to tin. And copper and tin together make bronze, which is sharper and better for doing farm work. It also makes better weapons. But the problem is that bronze is really hard to get because tin is really hard to get. And so for a long time during the Bronze Age, when people were using bronze tools, only the very wealthy people were able to have these tools, and poor people were still using stone. Later, as civilization became more complex and people learned more about metalwork, they started to use iron tools. And the benefit of iron is that it's a lot more readily available. There's iron all over the place. Iron ore that can be that's near the surface of the earth and is a lot easier to get your hands on. And so when iron tools become a thing, then metal tools become a lot more widespread, and everybody starts to use them, including poor farmers and slaves. So to summarize, today we talked about civilization. We talked about a number of features of civilization. We talked about 4 early river valley civilizations, and I told you why rivers led to complex societies. We talked about agriculture some more. We talked about the formation of social classes, and we talked about the evolution of metal tools. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you next time.